Welcome to another video lecture for Greek exegesis of Revelation. This lecture is entitled Revelation and Apocalyptic Literature. As I tend to do, let me give you a quick overview of what you can expect from this lecture. I want to start with some preliminary thoughts about the topic, apocalyptic, and why we might even consider it when reading the book of Revelation. Then I will talk more fully about the genre and characteristics of Revelation. Then I'll discuss apocalyptic as crisis literature, and I'll conclude by considering Revelation and or as apocalyptic literature. I wanted to sort of start with what I think is a rather popular notion and its connection with apocalyptic. And that is the notion of post-apocalyptic. Many of us, I would suggest maybe all of us, are familiar with post-apocalyptic scenarios. In film, we can think of movies like I Am Legend, War of the Worlds, or even the Hunger Games series. These are stories that take place after a world-ending event. Although, of course, because there's a story, this world is not ended completely. It's a story of survival. It's a story of maintaining and building human community, even in the midst of some really tragic experiences. When we hear the word apocalyptic, it's easy for us to associate it with these sort of end times or even post-end times scenarios. And that's not exactly what apocalyptic meant or what apocalyptic means in scholarly circles related to the New Testament. At its most basic level, apocalypsis, the Greek word for revelation, the title of our book, simply means uncovering. It is a revealing or a unveiling that happens. It doesn't necessarily have only to do with end times speculation, although a lot of apocalyptic literature, as we will soon see, does have this chronological or eschatological orientation. But it's more than just end times speculation. It really is about endurance in the present moment. It's about making sense of the present moment. And so it really has as much of an insistence or an emphasis on what is happening in the present moment as it does with what is happening in the future. Next, let me say just a few words about the genre of apocalyptic. To begin with, genre is a fancy word that we use to describe things that are similar or have shared characteristics. When it comes to literary studies, genre is important because we distinguish different literary genres. Think about fiction and nonfiction, newspaper writing and script writing for a play, or even writing copy for marketing and advertising. All of these are different types or genres of writing. Genres are simply a group or category of materials that share the same characteristics, and it's important to note that these genres don't fall from the sky. They are the creation, they are the work, the result of the work of scholars and others. And so they have a heuristic function, and we need not to use them or to think about them in too rigid a way. Really, genre is important because of its explanatory value. Because genres suggest the similarity of style, form, and content, that can help us make sense of various forms of literature. When it comes to the book of Revelation, one of the major impacts of understanding the genre of apocalyptic is that it can make Revelation seem just a little bit less strange. There is a very complex but important definition of apocalyptic that circles around in scholarly circles. And this is what it says. A genre, the apocalyptic is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient. disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial, insofar as it involves another supernatural world. So this is from a 1979 work that remains an important definition of genre. Of course, scholars have challenged it or nuanced it, but it's a base level and very complete definition of genre. Building on that definition of genre, we can talk about some of the characteristics of apocalyptic literature, many of which we've already seen in that definition. The first is that they are often first-person narratives, often told in a way that is pseudonymous, which means that it is a historical figure who died long ago is the narrator of the vision. And so we might have an apocalypse of Isaiah, or an apocalypse of Adam, or apocalypse of Abraham, folks from way back in a society's collective memory who nevertheless are depicted as the seer or the speaker in the apocalyptic text. It's important that these are narratives and that they're first-person narratives. So there's an I who speaks, there's an I who sees, and so forth. These apocalyptic writings tend to be historical and or spatial. Again, historical apocalypses have a focus on different epochs or periods of history that meet their climax in the end of days and God's final vindication of the people of God. Spatial apocalypses are more interested in extra-worldly realities, whether those be heaven, or in the case of parts of 1st Enoch, hell, or Hades. Very often, apocalyptic literature will include an angelic interpreter, somebody who accompanies the seer and offers explanations and interpretations of the stranger events that are happening in the narrative. There is often a strong contrast between the present and the future. The present is an age of chaos. The future is an age of order. The present is an age of suffering. The future is an age of consolation. The present is an age of persecution and suffering and domination. And the future is ultimately a time of God's final vindication. Very often, apocalyptic literature will use metaphorical language, symbolic language, language that really stretches the range of human concepts and human ideas. Scholars who study apocalyptic literature in a comparative way will talk often about the origins of apocalyptic. And there is some debate about whether apocalyptic or proto-apocalyptic originated in prophetic or wisdom traditions in the Hebrew Bible. You know, there is much about apocalyptic literature that resembles parts of the prophetic tradition. We can think about Ezekiel, his vision of the heavenly throne, or Isaiah 1, where Isaiah 6, where he's given the vision of heaven and his own commission. Also, very often, the messages or the themes of apocalyptic literature have similarities in the prophetic tradition. Scholars have also suggested that wisdom traditions are the origins of apocalyptic, maybe not the wisdom of Proverbs, but the more speculative wisdom of Ecclesiastes or Job. Wisdom that is beyond sort of common sense wisdom and is interested in the wisdom of the worlds, the workings of the world. Scholars tend to date the origins of apocalyptic to around the late Persian period or the early Hellenistic period in Israel's history. And because of this, scholars are able to suggest that there were a wide variety of cultural borrowings going on in apocalyptic literature. For example, borrowing an interest in astrology from Babylon, of geography from Greece, and belief in the resurrection and dualism from Persian culture. It is also common to think of apocalyptic as crisis literature, to think of it as crisis literature. And depending on how old you are, the REM song, "The End of the World as I Know It," may prove helpful in thinking about apocalyptic as crisis literature. These writings represent a breakdown in the world as the ancients perceived it. The world's order, the world's sense of right and wrong, the world's understanding of God, all of these things have come to an end, or they are at least at risk of coming to an end. And therefore it's crisis literature. Oftentimes, scholars connect the origins of apocalyptic with the works of Antiochus Epiphanes, who persecuted Jews and desecrated the temple in Jerusalem. And scholars have suggested that Daniel 7 through 12, portions of 1st Enoch, and the Testament of Moses, all examples of apocalyptic literature, were likely written in response to these traumatic events. Then another crisis moment was the Jewish war with Rome in the late 1st century, which likely penned or resulted in the composition of 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, other apocalyptic texts. And so these crisis moments really reveal two types of crisis. The first is the reality of human suffering and languishing. The second is a crisis in theology. Traditional notions of sin and covenant and God's sovereignty are all challenged by the experience of suffering and the pronounced experience of abandonment or alienation. What can we say then about Revelation and apocalyptic literature, or Revelation as apocalyptic literature? Well, there's a general tendency to think about Revelation as apocalyptic literature, as an example or as a type of apocalyptic literature. And there's a really good reason to think this, because there are a number of similarities. It's a first-person narrative. There's the presence of an angelic interpreter. It has both chronological, it has both historical and spatial elements. It is certainly concerned with the ultimate future vindication of God and God's people. It employs strong symbolic and metaphorical language. So much of Revelation aligns with what we know of apocalyptic literature. There are certain differences. The first is the obvious blending of genres, that in the first 3 chapters of Revelation, we have letters written to 7 churches in Asia Minor. These letters resemble the letters of Paul more than they do the writing of 1st Enoch or Daniel 7 through 12. And so at the very least, we would say that Revelation as apocalyptic is a bit different because of the ways in which it has meshed these generic qualities. Another modification that's important to notice is the timeline. Apocalyptic literature often is oriented towards an anticipated future event, a future vindication and redemption on the part of God. But for Christians and for the perspective of Revelation, that definitive event has already happened with the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so that definitive event is the anticipation of God's final victory. And so this timeline modification is also important. Another way that I have been encouraged to think about Revelation in recent months comes from Catherine Keller's perspective of Revelation as counter-apocalyptic. And the idea that instead of saying that this literature is completely deterministic, that those who are good, those who are bad, those who are going to be saved are going to be saved, and so forth, that really thinking through Revelation as a form of prophetic discourse always leaves open the room for repentance and for transformation, and that it carries with it an ethical exhortation that in many ways Revelation as a form of counter-apocalyptic is encouraging its hearers and readers to orient themselves and to inhabit the world in different ways because of the truth of what has been revealed through the death and resurrection of Jesus, and through the revelation of Jesus Christ that is given to John in the prophetic community. So what? Why does any of this make any difference at all? I think the first answer, and I have already mentioned, is that it makes Revelation less strange. If you only read Revelation in contrast to the rest of the New Testament, it can seem so out of place, so strange, so difficult to manage. But when you read it in light of and in comparison with other apocalyptic literatures, it makes a lot more sense. There's a lot more commonalities and points of connection if we read it in that way. The second thing I think that's important comes from the idea of apocalyptic literature as crisis literature. And that really underscores that Revelation is responsive in nature. It doesn't just fall out of the sky. It is not just a random vision given at some insignificant time. It is a responsive writing that is meant to help people experiencing a moment of crisis or an extended duration of crisis endure that crisis and to live faithfully and hopefully in the midst of it. And then I think that the final thing is it really helps us with the working or the function of Revelation. On the one hand, it affirms the reality of evil. It names evil. It even describes the pernicious and pronounced presence of evil in the world. But it insists upon God's final victory and the hope that that victory creates. It also helps us keep that major focus in mind that for all the dizzying language and symbolic and metaphorical constructions, that where it is leading its readers or hearers is to the ultimate victory of God. And then finally, that it reminds us that Revelation is a work of encouragement, that it is encouraging the hearers and readers to inhabit the world faithfully. Well, I hope that this brief lecture has helped you understand some of the characteristics and features of apocalyptic literature and how those are present in the book of Revelation, and why knowing this about apocalyptic can help us read and interpret Revelation more effectively. Thank you so much.